How's it going, everyone? Today's lecture, we will be discussing the autonomic nervous system. So the regulation of all these functions that you don't have to think about, such as breathing, your heart, your digestion, all these things that you do at rest without thinking about it. And then we also are going to introduce the somatic nervous system, which regulates our voluntary skeletal muscle movements. But we'll mostly be going over that autonomic nervous system today, and then just briefly introduce the somatic nervous system. And then in the next lecture, we'll talk all about skeletal muscle contraction. The autonomic nervous system is going to regulate the activity of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands within our body. And so all of these visceral organs within our body are going to receive both excitatory messages and inhibitory messages. And depending on the environment and what we're doing and what's going on, the autonomic nervous system will either excite certain cells and have them increase their activity, or it can inhibit certain cells in certain organs and have them decrease their activity. The autonomic nervous system has three different branches: the sympathetic branch, otherwise known as the fight and flight response, the parasympathetic branch, which is the rest and digest, and then the enteric branch, which regulates the action of your digestive organs. Again, these excitatory and inhibitory signals are going to depend on what we're currently doing. So for example, if we were going on a run, there is a need to get blood and get oxygen to the skeletal muscles that are contracting. So the sympathetic branch is going to increase the heart rate and the stroke volume of the heart. It's going to help increase our breathing, and then it's going to distribute blood away from digestive organs, because when we're on a run, we're not really worried about digesting food at that given moment, and then redistributing that blood to the skeletal muscles. So the autonomic nervous system is just going to adjust the activity of certain smooth muscles and certain organs just based on what activities and what the environment is at that given situation. Certain commands are going to be processed by the brain, and then a motor output will be delivered to that organ or smooth muscle or gland. So in order to communicate that message, we have motor neurons signaling to one another in order to carry that message through. And so what we're going to see in both the parasympathetic and sympathetic division is that a preganglionic neuron is going to basically run out of the spinal cord and then synapse with a postganglionic neuron at a place called the autonomic ganglion. And this is basically where preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons synapse, and then that message gets carried along. So in both the parasympathetic and sympathetic branch, these preganglionic neurons are going to release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine in order to activate postganglionic neurons. However, you could see that the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic branch are going to release different neurotransmitters. And for the parasympathetic division, the postganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine at these effectors or glands or organs, and the sympathetic branch is going to release a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. Here we could see an anatomical view of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. You could tell at the parasympathetic side that some cranial nerves are going to come out, preganglionic nerves, in order to send out parasympathetic messages to the different organs of the body. And then for autonomic responses that occur, let's say, below the belt, you have a few parasympathetic neurons stemming from the sacrum. But on the sympathetic side, you're able to see a key distinct difference, and that is that most of these preganglionic sympathetic neurons are going to synapse with their postganglionic neuron at a location called the sympathetic trunk ganglia, which is something that the parasympathetic division does not have. So this is a synapse location for a lot or most of these sympathetic neurons. And then that, once these ganglionic neurons are activated, they're going to send out their sympathetic messages to different organs and different cells of the body. Not only can the sympathetic nervous system release norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter in order to upregulate sympathetic nervous activity, it can also create a hormone called epinephrine that can be released through the bloodstream and bind to different targets in order to increase that sympathetic nervous activity. And how that works is these sympathetic neurons are going to stem down and synapse at a place called the adrenal gland, which is located on top of your kidneys. And in that adrenal gland, the section that produces epinephrine and some norepinephrine is called the adrenal medulla. So this neuron is going to synapse with these chromaffin cells. And what's going to happen is that they're going to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so these can then circulate throughout the bloodstream and then bind to different receptors located on different cells and organs. And just to note, I've probably said this before in past lectures, but epinephrine and norepinephrine, a lot of times in popular culture and even in medicine, are referred to as adrenaline and noradrenaline. I don't know why we have multiple terms in science for the same exact thing, but in this course, I'll just be referring to them as epinephrine and norepinephrine. And also, these two are categorized as catecholamines. The location where a autonomic postganglionic neuron is going to release its neurotransmitters is called the Neuro-Effector Junction. And so here we could see one of these autonomic neurons traveling down towards its effector cells or its organ, and you have these little bubbles here called varicosities, and within those varicosities you have synaptic vesicles, which are going to contain neurotransmitters, and then once those neurotransmitters are released, it's going to bind to receptors on the effector cell. We talked about how neurotransmitters are released in previous lectures, but once that action potential hits these voltage-gated calcium channels, calcium is going to flood in, and that's going to help activate certain proteins, which help these vesicles move to the presynaptic membrane. Once they fuse, these neurotransmitters are released into that synaptic cleft, that synaptic space there, and then they bind to their receptors located on the plasma membrane of that cell. So here we see at this neuroeffector junction, either norepinephrine is going to be released, and that's going to upregulate sympathetic nervous activity, or acetylcholine is going to be released, and that's going to increase parasympathetic activity. These branches of the nervous system are going to do different actions depending on what state we are in. And so the parasympathetic side is going to regulate and dominate during rest and digestion. And so right now you are sitting there, hopefully not too stressed out about anything, just watching this video, hopefully taking notes, and you are just resting, and so you have more so of a parasympathetic dominance right now, which is used to promote breakdown and absorption of food. And so right now your digestive organs are more active breaking down food, while things like your heart rate is a little bit lower than it would be if it was exercising. Your breathing rate is probably lower than it would be if you were in a stressful situation. And so once the parasympathetic side is dominant, activities like salivation, urination, digestion, these are then increased. But we also have a separate division, the sympathetic division, which is going to respond to more stressful situations. And it produces something called the fight or flight response, which supports bodily functions that help with vigorous physical activity and rapid production of ATP. And so, these are things like almost getting into a car accident, it's stomping on the brake and barely missing the person in front of you. You're going to see right away that your breathing is going to increase, your heart rate's going to increase, your blood vessels are going to be adjusted by this. So it's getting you prepared to either go into a stressful situation or run away from a stressful situation. So we have these autonomic reflexes to help us maintain homeostasis. So in the last example, I told you your heart rate or breathing rate may go up during a stressful situation, but we also have other reflexes such as coughing. So if something is obstructing your breathing pathway, you have this autonomic reflex in order to get that blockage out to cough. And so these reflexes, and they come in all different types, but they are there to try to protect us from any danger or prepare us for certain situations. We have different autonomic control centers in the brain to help basically dictate how much parasympathetic or sympathetic signaling needs to occur at this organ. And so we could see that in the brain stem and some located in the spine as well, there are these designated areas to basically regulate the different organs, the different visceral organs within our body. And so you have a respiratory center, cardiovascular center. So these areas of the brain are going to dictate, should we increase sympathetic signaling at this area, or should we increase parasympathetic signaling at this area? And these areas of the brain are basically going to balance the parasympathetic and sympathetic messages based on what is going on. We have to keep in mind that parasympathetic and sympathetic signaling at these cells are going to mean different things depending on where those neurotransmitters are binding to. So for example, when parasympathetic nervous activity is higher at rest, more acetylcholine is going to bind to receptors on the heart, which slows down heart rate. And since there's less sympathetic nervous activity going on, we're going to see a lower stroke volume, lower blood pressure. We're going to see our breathing rate and the depth of our breathing decrease compared to like a stressful situation. Blood vessels tend to relax during that parasympathetic activity. So a lot of these cells are inhibited. However, during that rest and digest, certain digestive cells are activated, right? So it really depends on, the organ that the neurotransmitter is binding to know the effect. And so parasympathetic, we're going to have, less activity out of the lungs, out of the heart, out of the blood vessels, but more activity in those digestive cells. While during sympathetic nervous activity, we're going to have higher heart rates, we're going to breathe in deeper, blood vessels are going to constrict and redistribute blood. And so these nervous systems are going to have many different effects on the organs within our body. We classify the neurotransmitters and the receptors of both divisions of the autonomic nervous system by cholinergic and adrenergic. And so cholinergic is going to be the neurotransmitters and receptors of the parasympathetic division, and that stems from the choline comes from the acetylcholine neurotransmitter and its receptors. And then adrenergic, so you're going to see here the adrenaline. So that's the receptors, neurotransmitters, and hormones of the sympathetic division. So again, cholinergic, or the parasympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, but I believe I said this earlier in other videos. A neurotransmitter is just a signal, and the action that takes place is just based on what receptor and what cell it is binding to. So you're going to see acetylcholine is just a neurotransmitter that has different functions depending on where it's binding to. But for postganglionic parasympathetic neurons, this acetylcholine that is released is going to lead to parasympathetic nervous activity at the effector cell that it binds to. But remember that both the sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine to activate postganglionic neurons. Acetylcholine is either going to bind to nicotinic receptors, which are inotropic receptors, which are again located on postganglionic neurons in order to activate them, or muscarinic receptors, which are the second type of cholinergic receptors, which are G protein coupled receptors. And so these receptors are located on different effectors throughout the body and will bring about parasympathetic nervous activity when acetylcholine binds to them. The adrenergic neurotransmitters and hormones are again norepinephrine and epinephrine, and we talked about these earlier, but norepinephrine is going to be the neurotransmitter, although it can be made by these chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, and then epinephrine is more of a hormone also produced by these chromaffin cells, but when they, either method, whether it be neurotransmitter or hormone, they're going to bind to what's called alpha and beta receptors. And so once epinephrine or norepinephrine binds to these receptors that are located on that target cell, it's going to increase sympathetic nervous activity. And so you may have heard these terms before, or you may not have known it, but a beta receptor, think about a beta blocker, which is used to lower blood pressure. And so that drug blocks these beta receptors from norepinephrine and epinephrine binding to them, and that in turn is going to slow down heart rate, and that's going to decrease blood pressure. So again, when you hear beta blocker, that's coming from the fact that we are blocking an adrenergic receptor, which is going to lead to a decrease in sympathetic nervous activity. Here we could see a summary of the autonomic nervous system. Up top we have the parasympathetic branch, where preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, which activates postganglionic parasympathetic neurons that also release acetylcholine. And when those acetylcholine neurotransmitters bind to cholinergic receptors on target cells, it promotes rest and digestion. So even though, in places like the heart, if parasympathetic activation is upregulated and acetylcholines bind to these cholinergic receptors, that's going to be a slower heart rate. In a place like the stomach or the digestive organs, if acetylcholine binds to those receptors, it's going to increase digestion and increase the activity of those cells. We also have the sympathetic division. Those preganglionic neurons are also going to release acetylcholine, but remember, the postganglionic neurons, they will release norepinephrine, and norepinephrine will bind to either alpha or beta receptors on their target cells. If it binds to a place like the lungs or the heart, we're going to see an increase in heart rate, stroke volume, blood pressure, depth of breathing rate. But at a place like the blood vessels, the smooth muscle cells, that's going to lead to their activation and their constriction of blood vessels. So again, these neurotransmitters, these hormones, are going to have many different effects depending on where they are binding to. I do want to highlight one specific outlier when it comes to the sympathetic nervous system, and that is the postganglionic neurons, which actually activate sweat glands. So these are actually cholinergic neurons, and they release acetylcholine. They're part of the sympathetic branch. They're still activated more so once sympathetic nervous activity is increasing, but they are going to release acetylcholine in order to activate sweat glands. And if you think about it, if we're doing physical activity, sympathetic nervous activity is going to go up. And so, in addition to breathing more and having a higher heart rate, one thing that's going to happen is that your core temperature is going to go up. And in order to release some of that heat, we sweat. And so that sympathetic division is going to activate these sweat glands in order to get rid of some of that increase in core temperature. The balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system is called our autonomic tone, which is going to be regulated by our hypothalamus. And so all the sensory information is going to come into the brain, and then the hypothalamus is going to help dictate, do we need more sympathetic nervous activity or do we need more parasympathetic nervous activity? And again, organs receive messages from both. But if we need to upregulate one side and, let's say, release more norepinephrine and epinephrine like we do during physical activity or exercise, well, then those organs are going to receive more signaling and they respond in a sympathetic manner. And it's like a seesaw. We don't want to send, there's not many times within the body that both sides of the nervous system are upregulated, because that would lead to massive disturbances throughout the body. And so when we need that fight or flight response, that sympathetic nervous activity will go up and that parasympathetic nervous activity will go down. While we're at rest, we get parasympathetic activation going up and sympathetic activity going down. That concludes the autonomic nervous system. I am going to introduce the somatic nervous system, which regulates the movement of our skeletal muscles, which we control voluntarily. But I'm only going to introduce this branch of the nervous system because we're going to talk more so about this at length when we talk about motor units and we talk about skeletal muscle contraction in the next lecture. In order for us to activate our muscles, signaling needs to go from the central nervous system and activate what's called an alpha motor neuron. Alpha motor neurons are going to be responsible for activating and leading to the contraction of extrafusal fibers located within our skeletal muscles. And so the alpha motor neuron and the different fibers that it innervates, that's called a motor unit. And based on what movement we're currently doing or how intense that movement is, our nervous system is going to activate a certain amount of fibers to conduct that movement. And let's say if we are, lifting up a heavy object, then we are going to need to recruit more motor units and more muscle fibers in order for that movement to be completed. The alpha motor neuron is going to release acetylcholine at a place called the neuromuscular junction. And acetylcholine is going to lead to this event at the skeletal muscle fiber called excitation-contraction coupling. And we are going to talk about that again in the next chapter, in the next couple of lectures. But this acetylcholine, as we discussed all throughout this video, it can have different functions depending on where it is binding to. And so, for the parasympathetic nervous division in the autonomic nervous system, it is going to do certain things when it binds to those specific organs, like slow down heart rate. But here, acetylcholine binding to receptors on skeletal muscle fibers, that's going to lead to skeletal muscle contraction. Here we can see a little bit closer view of the neuromuscular junction. We have the synaptic bulb of one of these alpha motor neurons, and what's going to happen is that acetylcholine is released by this alpha motor neuron, which is going to bind to receptors located on the skeletal muscle fiber, and that is going to create what's called an end plate potential, right? And so we're going to be depolarizing here in the skeletal muscle fiber, and that is going to propagate throughout the whole entire fiber and lead to a contraction. Again, we're going to talk more about this process in the next couple of videos. That will conclude this lecture on the autonomic and the somatic nervous systems for now. We did spend the bulk of this lecture on the autonomic nervous system. So just to recap, we have the parasympathetic branch, which is our rest and digest branch of the nervous system. We have the sympathetic branch, which promotes fight or flight, and then we have the enteric branch, which we didn't talk about too much, but it helps with our digestion process. But we are constantly balancing this autonomic tone, the balance between sympathetic signaling and parasympathetic signaling. Parasympathetic signaling is going to be higher when it's rest and digest. So the release of acetylcholine binding to cholinergic receptors is going to promote parasympathetic activity, while the release of norepinephrine by postganglionic adrenergic neurons and the release of epinephrine by the adrenal medulla are going to lead to more sympathetic signaling. And during sympathetic situations like exercise, we're going to need an increased heart rate, increased depth of breathing. While during, rest and digest situations, we don't need necessarily, high volumes of air coming into the system or high heart rates. We need cells of the digestive system to be more active. In the next couple videos, we are going to go deeper into the somatic nervous system. We're going to talk about how motor units are activated, and we're going to talk about how skeletal muscle fibers produce force and create movement within our bodies. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next lecture.